All right. When is when is fall break? Is that next week? Okay, because I was planning on just going ahead and doing this Thursday night anyway. Um, and I'm wondering, let's see, give me just a second here. Okay, Gothicism should be the last one. Because we could, what I can do is go through and change the due dates and stuff, so we just don't meet next week. What are the days that we have for fall break? Is it the entire week?
No, it's on Friday and Monday.
Friday and Monday?
Friday through Monday.
Friday through Monday. Okay, so we're still good to meet on Thursday. All right. Then that's what we will plan to do. And right now, what I have planned out is 15 weeks worth of stuff, where 14 weeks we do stuff, and one of them is kind of going over the final. And the last week, everybody is talking about their final projects. And I think things will work out really well. One thing I did get everything up until yesterday afternoon, everything had been turned in by 1 o'clock yesterday has been graded. And the, um, what's it called? Midterm grades are in. The thing that I find kind of frustrating for me about that, and I'm just whining. I mean, it's nothing against the university or anything. This is an online class. And you guys all know that my policy on due dates is everything is due on the last day of class of the semester. And in the meantime, the due dates are so you guys can stay on top of things. And so, a couple days after the due date, I will put on a zero and remind you to turn something in. But that's so that you remember to turn things in. And so for an online class, I think midterms are kind of silly, but that's just because of the way that I do it. If you guys were normal and healthy, you would be taking ordinary class with other human beings. Instead, you've chosen to take the class with me. So that says something about you and the lifestyle choices you've made so far. Which, thank you for the job, but I kind of feel sorry for your future family, whatever that may look like. However, um, there are a couple ways to increase your grade and see it go up rather rapidly. Do you guys remember what those are?
Resubmitting or fixing assignments, pretty
Yeah,
much.
yeah, pretty much. The easiest way to do it is to fix assignments. Another thing is a lot of you guys have done stuff where you just haven't submitted it yet. So submitting stuff. Those two things are the easiest way. Uh, Several years ago when COVID hit, one of my students was getting a really solid D minus. And the last couple of weeks, he was just saying, yeah, I'm just going to have to fail and take this class again. And then we found out that he had been taking care of his parents during COVID and just had been doing stuff but hadn't turned anything in. He started turning stuff in, and in that 2.5 weeks, he brought his grade from a D minus up to an A minus. And so and when you guys see, like, if you see a 20 on your, or either a 0 or a 20 on your project, that almost always means either it's doesn't fit the format that it's supposed to fit, or else you started, but you need to do some more things to get it right in line with the class. And one of the projects that I graded, the first initial turn in was a 0 because there was no valuation on what the project really was in connection with the class or how long the student took. And then the student and I just visited about what they could do, and they did the exact same thing, but this time they changed the presentation so it actually fit all the parameters of the class. And then, they got a really good score on it. So if you are unsure about how it fits in with the class, talk to me. And it may mean that you have to rewrite the opening paragraph. I think there's a couple of projects like that where they just have the project, but you need to have an introduction sometimes, unless it's completely and totally obvious. And even then, it's always safest to have an introduction. Like a lot of the times, if you're doing a project that's a research project thematically, then that theme needs to be introduced and tied into the class. Why is this thing valid? Like one person for the other one of the other classes I teach, they wanted to go through and examine symbolism from outside the parameters of the class, but because they were able to introduce it and show that it was linked to the scope of the class itself, and the link was really solid, it was a really good project. And so, if you're going down and you see a score different than what you want, don't pout and hide in a corner and cry about it, and then go over to Cameo's office and tell her that I'm the biggest jerk in the world and my parents should never have met. Rather than do that, look at what I've said, and if you don't understand, ask me and talk to me. And usually it takes anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour and a half to finish getting it into the shape it needs to. And then you turn it in and get full points. Not a big deal. The biggest problem that I've seen is people are not, don't have their citations completely done. Like sometimes people will just send in things with a hyperlink, and that doesn't count. Does anybody want to tell me what the format of the citation needs to be? What is the style that we have to use?
MLA.
MLA, that's exactly right. And at the end of your citation, you have a period. Then after the period, what do you have to have in order to get full points for that citation?
Accessed on date and
That's right.
In alphabetical order.
And they all need to be in alphabetical order. Excellent, very good. And those are really simple fixes. They may take you, if you are slow and have both eyelids tied behind your back, it may take you like 5 minutes to fix those, but that will garner you more points, just getting it taken care of. All right. So I wanted to talk about those things and make sure everybody understood them. I don't want anybody getting frustrated and upset because they just want to throw up their hands and leave. Let's see. Does anybody have any questions or anything like that about the material that you've gone over? Because we're going to start talking about it right now. Anybody have any questions so far? If you do, I don't really care. Oh, I'm also supposed to pretend that I care by saying something like, I hope you guys had a wonderful weekend. Anybody have any fun? But I don't care as long as you understand that. All right. In the end of the 15th century, so about 1475, to about the end of the 16th or 15th century, so about 1600, 1650, somewhere around there, that was called the Age of Exploration. And a lot of European powers were very interested in expanding their political reach to new areas of the world by a process called colonization, where it was politically advantageous to the colonizing powers to educate the colonized people that their value as human beings was completely dependent on their relationship to the colonizing powers that was advantageous to the colonizers. And see this in a lot of places in the world. It happened in a lot of places. This is where people stopped talking to heads of state of other countries as heads of state, and showed a profound amount of disrespect by just calling them chiefs and tribal leaders. And instead of talking about countries and empires, they would refer to them as just tribes. We see that as colonizers went to the continent of Africa in addition to the continents of North and South America. And it's pretty awful, because you look at the rest of the history of the world, and almost every time that countries would start dealing or treating with other countries, they did it on a basis of fellow heads of state, even if they knew they were militarily superior and could, clean their clocks. They still made a show of it. And it's interesting that during this age, the initiation of this age of colonization, no pretense was had. People were completely disregarded as human beings. And I think it's really, on one hand, if we step back emotionally, it's really interesting to see that. Emotionally, it's pretty devastating. A lot of people were very powerfully dehumanized. And you especially see that with institutionalized slavery getting to a point where the world had not seen to the massive scale the kind of dehumanizing slavery that took part at the beginning of the age of exploration. This is one of the very few times when a slave could be bought and sold with their children traded as commodities, their future children. And there are many examples in the Southeast United States, where I lived for a while, of where men and women were farmed out as trading stock so that their owners could make money through their pregnancy or through their fertilization, making somebody else pregnant. And just pretty awful. The reason why I say all that is that this is also called the era of enlightenment, if you want to believe that. And this is where a lot of people, it led directly from the Baroque era into the era of enlightenment, which is pretty much 1650 to about 1800. This is where we see the Industrial Revolution really kicking off and getting big. And this is where we see a lot of thoughts about self-direction, empowerment of the self, things like this, where people wanted to throw off the chains of outdated modes of political control. So even though on one hand you get institutionalized slavery that committed such horrors against our brothers and sisters that it would make Satan himself weep, on the other hand, you also get people that would write tremendous, wonderful, astounding thoughts that led to violent and peaceful revolts around the world, and led to people like George Washington Carver and Frederick Douglass, who was the most photographed celebrity in the world in the 19th century, to really honestly believe that there was hope for mankind. And it led directly to the abolition of slavery. So we get, it's really horrible dichotomy and very interesting dichotomy at the same time. The reason why I say all this is that during the Enlightenment, that's where we start seeing the model that we use today to view the world, where things are categorized with an implied hierarchy of importance or value. This is the system of thought that gives us today when legislators want to save money in the education system. And I'm using big foam finger air quotes when I'm talking about politics. The first things they cut are the arts and humanities courses, because of course those don't mean anything to anybody. You know, this is where we get the idea when you're studying religion as a pluralist minister, there's this subtle undercurrent that somehow shamanist and animist faiths are less valid than an anthropomorphic faith. And then when people approach moral living without the need for God, somehow that's the most valid pursuit of spirituality you can have. And that kind of hierarchy, what again was developed during the Enlightenment era. Dewey Decimal System, you know, John Dewey based his decimal system on this hierarchy. And you also get, this is what produced the hierarchy of sciences that leads today to a lot of hard scientists won't take the soft scientists seriously, you know, and which I think is kind of funny, but it led directly to the chain of thought that convinced Charles Darwin that only the most violent and brutal survive, which today biologists, anthropologists, and social scientists are realizing that, and biologists are really realizing that evolution is based on community support more than it is on the brutalist nature of the individual, which I think is really kind of fascinating. If anybody doubts that, just go out some time when you see a big flock of birds and see how they move around. And you'll notice that the big flocks of birds, they never follow a leader. You can think that because that's what it looks like. But if you pay attention, with each flap of the wings, the whole community is voting where the flock will move. And I think that that's really fascinating. Deer do the same thing. And almost any groups of animals. Anyway, I think all that is really fascinating. But what this comes down to, what I'm leading up to, is the conceit that somehow the Enlightenment was the only smart period of the world, and that they were basing themselves on the incredible genius of the very, very Eurocentric view that the Renaissance was all that and a can of chips, bag of chips. In order to make sure that everybody understood the European Renaissance was all that in a bag of chips, they had to make sure that the Renaissance separated itself and differentiated itself from everything that had gone before. So this is where we get the idea that before the Renaissance, everybody was just too stupid to draw a realistic human, and that nobody was smart enough to figure out lineal perspective, that none of our ancestors were smart enough to understand any kind of engineering. And the only ones that seemed to have a glimmer of hope, intelligent-wise, were the classical Greek and Romans. And so that period between the fall of Western Rome, which is about the middle half of the 4th century, and the beginning of the Renaissance, is about middle of the 14th century. So it's about a 1,000-year period. That whole period was labeled arbitrarily the Dark Ages. And that's what we're going to be looking at. As we do this, first, how many of you honestly think that our ancestors were a lot more stupid than we are today? You know, and I think that the biggest argument against their stupidity is the fact that our legacy 10,000 years from now will be cubic miles of disposable diapers hidden underneath parks and housing projects. And our ancestors' legacy, like in Göbekli Tepe of 10,000 years ago, were incredibly complicated temple systems where people would go on the chance and effort of trying to make themselves better human beings. What does that tell you about relational intelligence? You know, if the artifacts we leave behind are a record of how smart we are. But as we go through here, I want you to think, keep your eyes open for things like photorealism, you know, realistic portrayal, and ask yourself things like, why are objects or human beings distorted? Are they distorted because people are being dumb, or are they distorted because of the story that needs to be told. How many of you have ever watched a movie where the central portion you're supposed to be paying attention to is in focus and everything out of that is out of focus? How many of you have ever seen a movie like that? Or blurred or anything like that? It happens all the time. That's what we do to help us communicate things that are important. That's what our ancestors 2,000 years ago did. They did the exact same thing. If it was important, it was bigger and more in focus. Remember the eyes for the Etruscans, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Harappans? What about the eyes tell you that they are important?
The scale?
Yeah, they're bigger. They're in focus. And this is, it's not because people thought that your eyes were, 4 times bigger than they are. Has anybody seen Alita, Battle Angel Alita? That whole movie, the principal character is, oh, Mark, you saw it? That whole movie, the principal character, her eyes are animated so that they're 3 times bigger than ordinary size. I mean, that's because it's a film device, it's a communication device. So keep that in mind as we look at stuff. Okay, that's my rant for this week. If I hurt anybody's feelings, that's unfortunate. Okay.
No, I'd say it was a good rant.
Oh, thank you. Okay, Rome fell in 476 AD and everything sucked. And, our ancestors all of a sudden went from living happily side by side to eating manure and dying by the time they were 30 of all sorts of illnesses. Well, that did kind of happen in a lot of places, but it wasn't because our ancestors were stupid. This window, this is about 1,000 years old. It is the website that I got it from. It's a museum that kind of catalogs antique windows throughout throughout Europe. And these are some of the oldest windows. And this is what we typically think of when we think of Dark Age or medieval art. We get, distorted people, things aren't in focus, the colors are wrong, all that. What's interesting about that is this is the window with 1,000 years of wear on it. So it's not going to look the same as when it was first made, for one thing. But also we see the same kind of thing. These people are emphasizing the things that are important to them. They're working with a material that is notoriously unforgiving. And this material itself, right here, just in this portion, I can see where the windows over the last 1,000 years were replaced at least repaired at least 4 times. So when we're seeing this is not what it looked like the first time it was built. What we are seeing is after 1,000 years of wear. And I think that's something else that is missed a lot of times. People like to think that all this stuff that we see today is what it looked like when it was first made. And that's simply not true. We talk about Rome falling in 476 AD. What did we just talk about last week? Do you guys remember? What was one of the 2 groups?
The Byzantines?
The Byzantines. The Byzantines, that was the Eastern Roman Empire that started with Eastern Italy, moving into Turkey by Constantine. He left in the middle of the 3rd century. And that Roman Empire lasted for another 1,000 years, easily. It lasted longer than the original Western Roman Empire. And so, this idea that somehow the Dark Ages are because the the Roman Empire fell, we know that's not entirely true. And I hope as you go through here and look at this kind of stuff, you realize that most of the perspective we have about the Dark Ages is really incorrect, other than the fact it is true. Most areas in Europe, they did not have flush toilets or toilet paper. That is pretty devastating, especially to those of us who enjoy reading. What I want you to do is go through this and watch these two videos. And I want to, we do have a little bit of a timeline. I don't know if it's, yeah, we'll go through the timeline really quickly. And I also want you to look at the Encyclopedia Britannica article. I think that's really interesting. So I'm going to share this really quickly. So the Dark Ages goes between the fall of Western Rome to the 1350, about. And during this period, there's a lot of things that do happen. Some of the interesting things happen is we have two major renaissances that happened during this time, plus a continuation of high art in Turkey that nobody in Europe really wants to acknowledge, which at this time, which I think is really interesting. One of the two renaissances is called the Carolingian Renaissance, and we'll talk about that before tonight's over. And then the other Renaissance is the Middle Eastern Renaissance that happened with the rise of Islam. And we talked a little bit about that last week. I think this is a pretty good painting that kind of illustrates what most people think of when they think of the Renaissance. I mean, not the Renaissance. When they think of the Dark Ages, this painting is pretty good. If it will actually load on my computer. I'm sorry. I do not understand what my, okay, here we go. I'm going to try this. Okay. When we look at this painting, the things that oh, gee whiz. Are you guys seeing this page isn't working as well?
Yes. Hang on, I'm going to check Britannica.com.
Okay.
Okay,
Can you guys see the
show
painting?
for a brief second? We can see it, but it's, yeah, we can see it. I
Okay.
can at least.
All right, can everybody see this painting? Okay, Joey. All right, good. This is typically what we think of as the Dark Ages today. And a lot of this comes from the magic cinematography of Hollywood. A lot of really cool costumes and really distorted perspective. Now, when we look at a painting like this, there's a couple things that I want you to be mindful of. Space is at a premium and materials are at a premium. When you're putting this kind of color into something, there's a lot of expense involved. That blue comes from lapis, which is not inexpensive. It's essentially a gemstone. Green and red are also really expensive colors. And when somebody is painting something like this, the style of the time was not just to relate what anybody could see out the window. The style at the time was also to communicate a story. So the artist up here will be, this is an identifier for what time and date this thing happened. So this event happened towards the evening. This person is carrying the evening star. And these represent constellations so that whoever's looking at this would know when this is happening. And a good set of clues for that is this grid system here implies a calendar. So you know this is set inside of a time. And then also the arch that's being painted in is indicative of the vault of heaven. And if we look at this right here, this is not intended to be identifiable as a particular city. It is intended to communicate the idea that this is a city. And the less realistic or the more distorted the architecture is, usually it's an indicator of how unimportant the actual city is. So this is pretty accurate architecture. So I'd say that it's probably okay. It's probably relatively important for you to know what the city is, but it's still kind of arbitrary as to what the buildings are. So it's not specific as to any particular city. Now, sometimes in medieval or Dark Age art, you'll see really distorted and impossible architectural structures. What that is specifically intended to communicate is that the scene takes place near a building or is sheltered, but it's not intended to be any specific building. What is fascinating to me is you start looking at the horses and the people, and even though the clothing has that same kind of Byzantine abstraction quality going on, the body shape is not that important. It's more important to see the flowing of the cloth. The faces are picked out pretty cleanly. And then you also have the horses are very specific. As you look at this, the trees are rather generic, but the flowers are very specific. What does that communicate to you from the things that we've just been talking about? What does that communicate to you about the relative importance of different elements of the painting?
The flowers are more important than the trees?
Yeah, the specific species of flower is going to be important. The specific individuals are going to be important. And the fact that these horses are what they are is going to be important. So that would communicate to me that whoever commissioned this portrait is very happy with their reputation as horse breeders, or they want people to know that they have expensive horses. The specific species of flower, I don't know what that is, but it's apparent that that's important. And I would venture a guess that bears a direct relationship to a family crest. That flower will tell you who commissioned the painting. And then I'd be willing to bet that the faces are specific because people that were known to whoever would be viewing this painting were specifically seated for those portraits. So there are some specific things that we can figure out. Oh, what did I do? I'm sorry. Okay. There are some specific things that are communicated. Again, social media at this time was the troubadours, paintings, and then sewing, tapestries, things like that. And keeping that in mind, think about the technology and skill set you need to have to create the different things and use that to inform your judgment of the artwork. And that will really go a long way in helping you to understand and appreciate why imagery was distorted the way it was. It has a lot less to do with skill level and a lot more to do with communicating what was important to either the artist involved or whoever was commissioning the artwork. Now I want you to look at this. This is made during the Dark Ages. Would you say that this is very photorealistic or really abstracted?
I'd say it's pretty realistic.
Yeah, it's incredibly realistic. This was made 1600 years ago. And the idea that the Dark Ages, all of a sudden, people didn't know what to do is really appalling to me. What's interesting, her face is about a half an inch across. That's the kind of scale that we're dealing with. Look at the detail. So this eye is less than 1/8 of an inch from here to here. it's obvious that whoever carved this really knew what they were doing. These are two videos that I really want you to watch. One of them talks about the Dark Ages, and it really builds on some of the stuff that we were just talking about. Why would learning about feudalism be important? Feudalism seems to be the political structure very common to cultures all across the planet. Feudalism is essentially you have an individual who owns the land, then people work on the land, and they pay the right to use the land, pay for the right to use the land to the landowner, and whatever they have left is either eaten up by taxes, or they get to eat it themselves, or they get to sell it, whatever they want to. A really benevolent landowner will take just enough to make their own lifestyle palatable and make sure that all of their people that live on their land are happy. They will produce more than enough to pay their share of taxes to the person that they owe fealty to, and they will ensure that everybody in their under their political control is healthy enough that when there's a call to arms, they can provide soldiers. A really bad landowner thinks that everybody exists to serve their purposes and will just take whatever they can off their land, to the point where the people may very well begin to revolt. What's interesting is that in many cultures, the idea of the mandate from heaven that we talked about when we were looking at China seems to appear in different vocabularies in pretty much the same kind of expression. And it doesn't matter what continent you're on. When somebody follows this kind of feudal system of the landowner, people living on the land and then essentially renting it, wherever that shows up around the world, it seems that there is this suggestion of something parallel to the mandate of heaven, from heaven, where the Lord has the right to do what they want because God put them there. But if they abuse that right, then the deity will withdraw their support. You see that? Remember when we were looking at China, that was the justification after the fact of why dynasties fell, because they lost the mandate of heaven. Do you guys remember that when we were talking about China a couple weeks ago? I'm going to do a share again. I want you guys to go through as much of this as you possibly can, and then look at the art, because it will really help. And all this is important. Do you remember what we were talking about last week about how to recognize saints in Byzantine art and recognize icons in Byzantine art? Do you guys remember that? This talks about that quite a bit more in depth. The triggers that show you, or the symbols that show you who the saints are, who the evangelists are, all that kind of stuff, they're called attributes. And that was very important when you weren't really sure of the relative skill level of the artist that was doing stuff. You could always tell, though, who the person was in the painting, or hopefully you could always tell. And it's interesting that during the leading into the Renaissance and during the Renaissance, a lot of people commissioning paintings and portraits would use attributes of the saints to align themselves in the viewer's mind to, for example, St. Paul or Saint whoever. And you saw a lot of popes that, would have their portraits painted doing the same kind of blessing mudra that Christ would use, be shown in, which I think is, I'm sure that's complete coincidence. Does anybody know what Plato's theory of forms is? Have you guys heard of that?
I've heard of the term Platonic ideal. It's something probably related to that.
Yes, it is. It is related to that. The theory of forms was something that Plato articulated, but it is something that, oh, that is weird. I do not understand this.
What's going on?
I'm sorry, my view of everybody is just really kind of screwing up. Okay, the idea of the theory of forms is that, and I want you guys to watch that video. It's about a 4-minute video or so. It essentially comes down to the idea that, you know, there's 1,000 different ways to make a chair, but the way that we recognize a chair is because somehow, somewhere, there is this ideal world where the ideal form of a chair exists, and our spirit on some level connects to that. So when we see something that we identify as a chair, it's not because our brain is processing and extrapolating all of our experience. It's because our brain is connecting to our spirit, which in turn is connected to this world of the ideal, or the world of the truly real. What is interesting about that is as you look at paintings from this time period, and I'm talking about from the middle of the 5th century all the way up to beginning of the Renaissance and through and into the through a lot of the Renaissance, there is this idea that oh, that's weird. Okay. I'm going to stop sharing so it's less confusing. You see backgrounds where you do see specific plants, but they're layered around in the background like botanical specimens. You guys have seen the image of the unicorn in the little circular pen and stuff like that. People, a lot of art history makes the assumption that that's because our ancestors couldn't do things any other way. But what our ancestors were actually communicating is the idea that you have the background with perfect botanical specimens in it, because that symbolizes for you that whatever is going on is meant to be seen as taking place outside of time, and that it exists in a plane more closely allied to the world of the truly real. So it's not considered, it's specifically designed not to be seen as taking place in the world that we normally share. And so you see that in a lot of depictions of saints suffering. They'll have this weird background behind them. There's a lot of Middle Eastern stuff, like we just saw with that one painting with everybody on their horse, and you have all the trees in the background, obviously not very naturalistic. If the artist could not be naturalistic, they would not have done the bush in the foreground so you could identify the species of flower. All right? That kind of abstraction, that kind of symbolic pattern making with natural elements is specifically designed to communicate the idea that there are elements of this that are supposed to take place outside of time. It's kind of like saying, not like saying, but it's kind of the same kind of thing like what Andy Warhol did when he did the icon portrait of Marilyn Monroe. Whenever anybody thinks of Marilyn Monroe, nobody thinks of her as a human being anymore. They think of her as a timeless beauty. And a big part of that is because of Andy Warhol's portrayal of her. And one of the reasons he was doing that, he was Rosicrucian and understood a lot of these kinds of principles, is he was trying to tap into that same kind of symbolic methodology and communicate that now she resides in the world of the ideal. I don't know if any of you followed that or not, but that's kind of what's going on.
I did.
An example. What's that?
I did.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say it too. I think it's interesting to consider how, like, we're just drowning in imagery. We just, open our phone and see a million different things every single day. And I wonder how common it was for somebody to even encounter art at all back then. And so it's just interesting for me to think about what that experience would have been like to even just see this sort of imagery or painting
I think that that's a really good observation because art is expensive. It's expensive to produce. Like Joey, your simplest camera setup is a lot more than anybody's going to make in a day. You know, it's not cheap stuff. And the people that commissioned art generally would commission art either for their own use to show off to their neighbors or as a community project to remind everybody how powerful they were and how rich they were and how influential they were by sharing some of their own wealth with everybody. And you know that's a very stilted way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that a lot of selfless people with lots of money to burn wanted to beautify everybody's life, and I think that that's just as valid. But that perspective also kind of is a good thing too because it illustrates the change in perspective that we have today about what art is. Today we view art as something you buy and sell. It's a commodity. And our ancestors 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, art was part and parcel of everyday life. And you would also have the art that would be that special thing, like Joey said, that you'd encounter when you go to church, for example, or when you'd be invited to the Lord's house. A lot of the times when people made their own stuff, you look at what survives and the craftsmanship is impeccable. The awareness of forms is impeccable. Even the simplest things, when it's made by somebody who's trained in woodworking, for example, like a journeyman, it's beautiful. Like a flour barrel made in the 9th century by some Carolingian is going to be much more beautiful than anything you find today at any of the stores we go to. And so more art is infused into everyday life, but art as a separate artifact was, I think, pretty rare indeed because it's expensive. So yeah, and you know this idea when we're talking about symbolism, and we're talking about this idea of world of the real or the world of the ideal. When we look at these medieval paintings of baby Jesus, you know, like this one that I just showed, we know that this is Jesus because of the cross and the halo. And a lot of these babies, you look at them and they look just a little bit too knowing. And a lot of them are distorted, so they look like angry old men. Like this in particular, this is a really horrible perspective. But there are some very specific reasons as to why. You know, I think this is a particularly good image. Does she look very realistic? I really don't think she does. And this definitely does not look very realistic. So we know that their contemporaries were, this is 1460, this is in the middle of the Renaissance. We know that their contemporaries were doing something that were hyper realistic, incredibly realistic. It's just a relatively few years later that you have Pieta, which is Mary holding her dead son, that is just incredibly hyper real. So why do you think she looks so inhuman and he looks like an angry man?
I think it's to like emphasize their holiness. They're not like entirely of the material world.
Yes, very much so. There's a couple of things going on. First off, her skin tone is pallid. It's horrible. So is the baby's skin tone. The baby's does not look healthy. In these kinds of paintings, a lot of the times you'll see Mary having a very extended fingers, a very flat face that looks more like a death mask than a face. And these kind of choices are done very specifically to communicate that Mary exists, but she exists outside of time. And this is more often than not the artist's attempt to create that connection with that world of the ideal. The artist knows how to paint a living person, but Mary is not supposed to be mortal, so she can't look mortal. And baby Jesus, the doctrine of the time was that Christ was born with all the knowledge of his 33-and-a-half-year-old self, and that he was destined from the point of his birth to be the full manifestation of who Jesus became through the New Testament. And in order to communicate that, at this time, who remembers what the literacy level was? You guys remember? 20% or less. So when you're communicating a lot of stuff, it has to be communicated visually. So by making this somebody that you know is supposed to be a baby, but is obviously looks like a much more mature individual, you're also communicating the fact that they have access to old man knowledge. And that's why they look like a man. So they're designed to look slightly surrealistic, to pull them outside of that normal relationship with time like we all share, and propel them into that world of the ideal or the world of the truly real. And baby Jesus is shown as an old man to communicate that idea that he is something more than an ordinary person, a great deal more. And I wanted to share a couple things that I thought were really interesting. As you look through these videos, yes, Mark.
Yes, I was gonna add about the medieval literacy rate that I think I read somewhere that literacy around that time was more defined about how well you could read and write Latin. So I think the percentage of people who could do that might have been 20%, but I'm not sure if that applies to being able to read and write. Period. Wow, it's just a thing I wanted to add.
The sources that I looked at were people in general. Okay, and even saying that, I think that's being generous, because for several hundred, it wasn't until about the 8th century that there was any sort of a shared script. And I can imagine how difficult it was if you could read English as it was written in Wales, and then you took a trip to the mainland and went through France. I mean, good luck reading anything there. It was Charles the Great who was the first person to really create a shared script of any kind, so people could actually read what other people 200 miles away were writing. This I think is really kind of interesting. I like this video because it talks about the different ways that people made calendars. And what's interesting to me is that you also, we think, okay, well, literacy is a mark of intelligence, and honestly, it's really not. The capacity to remember and manipulate information, I think, is one of the marks of intelligence. Literacy definitely helps with that. But what is astounding to me is that the kinds of things that people remembered is very different than what we're familiar with today. Like we're used to a lot of things like muscle memory and things like that. At this time, you would have a lot of people on an estate that were accountants that would keep track of things with the European equivalent of the abacus. That would be very hard for us to manipulate today. You'd have troubadours that would remember, that may have anywhere from 400 to 1,000 songs in their repertoire. And if they were lucky enough to get like a lute with movable frets, they would be, they could do all sorts of different scales and do different things. So you could have them do a song with a different rhythm or meter, and have them do it in a completely different scale. So something that at one point would be a happy song, the troubadour could communicate as a really sad song. And I think that stuff like that, I think is really pretty astounding, having that kind of mental flexibility. So, go through here and look at these. A lot of these are really short videos that talk about the different kinds of arts that were available at the time. And we're not, if we were in person, then I would walk through these and watch a lot with you. But I want to have you look at these things so you could get an idea of what kind of art was produced for what kind of purposes. When we look at manuscripts, a lot of the times you'd have paintings that were the size of maybe 2 by 2 inches or 3 by 3 inches at the most. And so a lot of information would have to be communicated in that. And so that's when we start seeing things like big faces and big hands, because those were important for communicating what's going on. The Lindisfarne Gospels, I think, are a really good thing to look at. So definitely check that out. This idea of why did knights fight on snails, I want you to watch that. I think it's kind of a fun one, but it addresses the idea that you are communicating a lot in a very small amount of space. So this whole painting is about 2 inches by 2 inches, for example. And you look at this, and if you're thinking, okay, the brush they had was probably made with squirrel hair, and this is probably a brush that has maybe 6, 8, 10 hairs in it at the most. And this person, this whole figure is maybe 3/8 of an inch across. Then all of a sudden, do you get a sense that maybe this is a little bit more accomplished than what we think? I mean, when this is the equivalent of, a person is painting with a toothpick and trying to make it look realistic. And so you have these hands that are, yes, they are kind of distorted, but what is this distortion of hands and this particular distortion of facial features? What does that communicate? Is this lady happy, sad, or upset? It looks to me like she is writhing her hands. She's wiggling her hands because she's really concerned. Looks like she's very upset. This person has no idea what to do, and he's trying to comfort her. This is a doctor who's trying to take care of this person, trying to give him medicine, and they're like sneezing in the corner. And all of this hand right here is maybe a 1/4 inch in length. Has anybody considered that before? That a lot of the times when we look at these paintings and dismiss them as being unaccomplished, that we don't realize the scale? The other reason I want you to look at those videos is they will have a lot of artwork in them for you to look at and see what is most interesting to you. And this is King Charlemagne. Charlemagne is French for Chucky the Great. Basically, that's what his name is. And he is really pretty amazing, this guy. Definitely watch Charlemagne in 8 minutes. And I want to share with you a little bit of the music. But I don't know if we need to. Let's see how much time we have. We got to have, okay, yeah, we can hear the music. Charlemagne pulls up on the scene around 8th century or so. So this is about 300 years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And what he does is essentially he takes over, just like what Emperor Qin did in China. Charlemagne did the same thing in Europe, and mostly Western Europe. And what he essentially did was unify all the warlords, all the warring feudal landowners. And he actually went in and, depending on who you talk to, either he had a very sincere conversation with the Pope or he kidnapped the Pope and held him in ransom until the Pope agreed to him. Either way, it worked out. But the Pope acknowledged him the Holy Roman Emperor. And this is where we get that term. What's interesting about his accoutrements, and this is actually, looks to me like it's probably a Baroque era carving of Charlemagne, but it's interesting because the imagery originated with Charlemagne in the 8th century. And that is this staff, this kind of crown, and this idea of a globe with a cross on it. And you see these in a lot of European monarch portraiture to this day. What this globe with a cross on it, or it's a little sphere or giant pearl with a cross on it, represents that they control the world under the guidance of God and under the benevolent, watchful eye of Christ. And this is a staff that is a measuring stick, and it is a direct allusion, or direct connection to the word logos in the New Testament that John uses. And logos, of course, is also the word that John uses to describe Christ. But logos is a Greek word that means measuring stick or word. And in this case, it's a measuring staff that was used by the king to remind everybody that he is the ultimate arbitrator. He's the person that decides the final judgment. And it's also kind of a subconscious reminder that he represents, like the Pope does, the will of God. Is anybody interested in listening to any Carolingian music?
I would.
Okay. Okay, this is what Old French sounded like at this time.
Language. Français. La chanson de Roland.
Belle fut l'ivestre et les soleils truclés. Les dissimulés fait Charles Establé. Et le grand verger fait les reis tendre un trèfle.
Do any of you know French? French hasn't changed as much as English has over the intervening years, but I've heard that this sounds really kind of weird as French. But I thought it was interesting to hear it anyway. And this is what they think music at the time sounded like. I think that's kind of fun, but I really like this one. As soon as I can skip past the ad.
I fall upon my sword.
Do you guys recognize the 9 Inch Nails song in there?
I think there's one of these of We Didn't Start the Fire, and it's actually used. I think it actually used historical references from the medieval period.
Well, a lot of it's an interesting music style, and it's not what we're familiar with today, but I think it's really fascinating, and it sounds a lot more simple in a lot of ways. But I want to share with you very specifically these two videos that talk about Carolingian art, so we can actually see some of it. What is fascinating to me about Charlemagne and Merovingians leading into Carolingian art, and these all tie together, is that the Merovingians were a group of French kings that tried to bring all France together underneath Catholicism, and they gave legitimacy, Catholic legitimacy, to Charlemagne. And what Charlemagne did, once he was able to unite everybody, is he actually brought the literacy rate in Europe up significantly, because he was able to protect people that were making books. He was able to get a consistent language shared by everybody. And he was able to make 2 different specific scripts that were common for Roman letters all across Europe. And the scripts are in modified forms what we still use today. I think that's absolutely amazing. So so we're going to watch this. We have about a half an hour. I want to watch the introduction of Merovingian art and watch this this stuff. And I think I want to look at, I'm not going to watch the video on Carolingian architecture. We'll just look at that article so we can see some examples of it.
Now, as we get into Europe, we're going to start with the Merovingian and Carolingian dynasties. And basically, we're dealing with France and part of Germany. Now, during this period, early on, right after the fall of Rome, around the year 500, we have a ruler by the name of Clovis. And he's a ruler over a group called the Franks, and they will conquer Gaul in 500. He's sort of the progenitor, the first of the Merovingian rulers. Now, Clovis is a ruthless monarch and will kill any possible rival. But in battle one day, he had married a Christian woman, and he's losing a battle. What he does is he prays to God, prays to her God, as he puts it, and says, basically, if I can win this battle, I will convert myself and my people to Christianity. Well, he does, and then, well, he does. And he converts the Franks to Christianity. The church will support him 100% in this. And this also leads to differing images of Jesus as we are now converting Northern Europe. Now, as Clovis converts, the reason the church is in favor isn't just because of the converts, but because now with the fall of Rome, they didn't have someone who would support them in a military manner. But with Clovis, you have the Franks who will support the church, who provide a terrestrial army for them. Now, we see Gallic culture, which is primarily Celtic, mixed with Roman, Christian, and various barbarian, so-called barbarian cultures, such as the Franks, and they start to merge and create different European cultures. Eventually, the Frank landowners and the French and Roman landowners start to intermarry, creating this single aristocracy. And the Merovingian kings will treat all their sons equally in inheritance, and this will be a huge problem later on because it's going to result in dividing the kingdom constantly. Now, at the same time, in the Byzantine dynasty, we're just getting to Justinian around 500. And in Islam, Islam hasn't quite formed yet, but we're very quickly going to get to the Umayyad dynasty, bringing its form of Islam into Spain and up towards France, an issue that will be key later on. And what we're looking at, the initial Frankish territories are actually these dark green areas. And it's kind of interesting because this is basically Germany. And the Franks will eventually kind of swap over and take over France, and that's where France will get its name. And we see that Clovis will add all of this massive territory, much of France, during his lifetime. By the time we get to Charlemagne, most of Western Europe is being controlled by this group, but they're not called the Franks at that point.
Okay, we're going to watch this next one too. It gives you a little bit of background. So again, just as a quick side note, when did Clovis come in? You know, the fall of the Roman Empire was the middle of the 400s. Clovis showed up at 500. There's really not that much of a dark age. Clovis was the one, he won the battle in 500, and everybody was forcibly converted at the point of the sword to become peaceable, loving people, and under the banner of Christ. And which, I don't know, that always bothers me. Whenever anybody is forcing you to join a religion of peace, it seems counterintuitive to me. But one of the things that's interesting to me, and you'll see this in symbolism that shows up in a lot of the artwork too, it's kind of a subtle thing, is that the Merovingian kings believed that they were directly descended from Mary Magdalene, and which I think is really interesting. That's one of the reasons why a lily, a stylized lily, is in the flag, in the symbolism of France, because that lily is one of the saintly attributes to Saint Mary Magdalene.
Looped fibula.
Okay, now we're going to start looking at some of the artifacts from Merovingian and Charlemagne times. So we're talking about 500 to about 800.
First piece, the Merovingian looped fibula. And in this case, a fibula is basically something we've seen before. It's effectively a brooch to hold up the end of a toga or a not a tunic, a cape, basically. Obviously.
Does anybody want to guess why they called it a fibula instead of a brooch? Anybody? I will tell you why.
It's named after the calf, the leg bone.
Well, the reason why it's called a fibula rather than a brooch is that everybody knows you're an academic. And that's pretty much it. It's why we use the term terracotta to describe clay instead of using the word clay.
Well, huh.
People are wearing multiple layers, and Roman fashion is still there. People are still wearing togas, etc., but they're evolving into more of a cape than they would have been in Roman times. And this is done in gold with this incredible decorative pattern added to it.
Okay, so this is a brooch. Size-wise, this is maybe 2.5, 3 inches across, about 6 or 7 inches long. Think about that for just a second, the level of detail. These people do not have soldering irons. They don't have any sort of thing like a Dremel. All of this is by hand with a forge, hammers, and chisels. Think about that for just a second. So basically, they are making the equivalent of an iPad, using something that the tool is big enough you can rest on your shoulder. I mean, it is pretty astonishing what these guys are doing technologically.
The decorative pattern is meant to accentuate the form and amplify the form and structure. Now, as we look at it, we have an eagle head at the bottom. That eagle head is there to denote power. Images of any kind of animal of prey or bird of prey will always denote power. The fish denotes Christianity, but also mimics the general form of the fibula. And we see other symbols here, such as a cross, again, speaking to Christianity. The duck heads, or stylized duck heads on either side, are there to show power again, sort of that idea of the eagle and the duck, the eagles ruling over the ducks as people saw it at the time. And it's adorned with precious stones. In this case, each of these is a cut stone. As we see here, you can see the back of it, and you see those cut stones put in place and polished. And those would have been precious stones at the time, just like our garnets on the purse cover from Sutton Hoo. Now, as we move forward, we move into the Carolingian dynasty. Now, the Carolingians are sort of the people in the background for the Merovingians. They're the ones who have access to power. They are the gatekeepers, and they're slowly going to take over. They're going to expand power by making their post hereditary, and then Pepin, a man by the name of Pepin in 687, leads his army to start conquering other groups. A little bit later, we have Charles the Hammer Martel. I love these nicknames. Now, Charles the Hammer Martel will fight the Muslim armies in 732 at Tours. This is as Islam is expanding out of Spain and trying to push into France. His leadership provided a united response amongst the Franks, and he won many other battles, thus consolidating power over the Franks and extending the borders. This is really where the Carolingians take over for the Merovingians. Now, he dies in 741, divides the land between his two sons, Carolman, who's more or less irrelevant to this story, and Pepin the Short. Yes, he's known as Pepin the Short. At this point, the Merovingians are basically puppet kings. They're being controlled by the Carolingians, and they know it, and they're going to disappear rapidly. Pepin the Short writes to the papacy for help. In 751, Pepin the Short is anointed king by a papal representative, thus formally ending Merovingian reign and ushering in the Carolingians. And the most famous leader, Pepin the Short's son, is known as Charles the Great, or Charles the Bald, also known as Charlemagne. And what we're looking at is an equestrian portrait of Charlemagne.
I want to look at this with you. There's some really interesting things about this that I think are indicative of this era of artwork by itself. One is this is a bronze. Bronze is not a cheap material. It is the most expensive material that you can sculpt with. And so doing something like this was really a prestigious monument for Charlemagne. Charlemagne is French for Chuck the Great. So, you know, that's who he was. There's some interesting things about this that I want to point out. What is interesting to you about this leg here, the head, and the relationship of this leg to the body, and maybe this head too? What are some of the things that you see that are interesting and unexpected in this image? I think the first thing that I see is there's a lot of realistic kind of stuff, but the proportions overall are off. Does
I noticed that the horse's leg is like weirdly round. Like there's not like a true bend to it.
It is very weird. Yeah, definitely. And then you look at this leg is a lot longer than this head and torso should suggest. Like this leg is maybe 30% longer than it should be if that's where the knee is and this is where the hip is. Yeah, this looks like a Gumby leg, just like what Milo was saying. And so it's fascinating to me. At this time, horses that were destriers or horses that carried armed people into battle were short and stocky. They were the size of ponies today. So they were a lot smaller. So that's one thing. But there's very few horses that will have a leg like this that can actually walk. And what's fascinating to me, you know, we see these things. This head looks pretty realistic. These hindquarters look pretty realistic. This section from the knee down to the toe looks very realistic. You know, the drapery of cloth right here looks realistic, but the whole thing seems oddly distorted. And one of the things that I'm wondering is how much of that is because these people were not really aware they weren't really comfortable with using bronze, or maybe bronze was a super expensive material. What's fascinating to me, do you guys remember when we saw the Harappan imagery of the king, where the head was really big and the torso was kind of tiny? Do you guys remember that from a few weeks ago? It makes me think of the same kind of thing going on here. And I can't help but wonder, we know that people were moving around the world. We know that people did. There is evidence, archaeological evidence, that people from Ireland in the 3rd century had made it all the way into Oklahoma. I don't know if you guys knew that. But people did move around. And it's interesting to me is you look at Ife bronzes, which we'll look at a little bit later, you see similar kind of distortions going on. And I can't help but wonder, is this because the person whose life and livelihood was on the line to do the very best that he could to make sure that this sculpture stood the test of time and he just screwed up? Or is it because there's a different set of priorities that have more to do with identifying who this individual is and emphasizing those portions of whatever this imagery is that are important to the person who commissioned it? My thought is that's probably more what's going on. So I bet behind each of these distortions that we see, there is a story that we just don't know about. Because if this leg was straightened out, it would be significantly longer than this leg. That's one thing. And if this guy actually stood up, it'd be very uncomfortable because his proportions are not like the rest of us. So it makes me wonder, do you guys get the sense that it's a question more about what the priorities were as opposed to that the guy just didn't know what he was doing?
I think I can agree with that.
Okay. I'm glad that somebody agrees with me.
Now, Charlemagne is well trained in the liberal arts. In 800, Charlemagne becomes Emperor of the Romans. Again, they're trying to recreate the Roman Empire. Everyone's trying to recreate the Roman Empire. It's sort of like today we see people trying to recreate the 1950s and 60s because that's when they were children. That's when these people were growing up. So they have great nostalgia for the period. In this case, they're looking back and going, wow, mankind hasn't done well in Europe since the Romans. They're trying to go back to that. And he's going to be crowned by Pope Leo III. This action creates a mutually beneficial relationship. Charlemagne gets the backing of the papacy, and the papacy gets yet another army. And we get the equestrian portrait. And this is a very odd-looking portrait. It looks too simplistic. For example, Charlemagne doesn't seem to have any neck. He seems to have a massive hand, that hand holding the globe, and he seems to be massive compared to the size of the horse, although we've seen these ideas before. In the portrait, the globe represents that he's the ruler over the world. Of course, they know there's more to the world than what Charlemagne rules, but it's a symbol of power anyway.
Isn't it interesting that even though this is supposed to be in the middle of the Dark Ages and all our ancestors were really stupid, they still knew that the Earth was a globe? Were you guys aware that there was a Greek mathematician that figured out the circumference of the world from pole to pole around the equator, and then the average as well, about 2,200 years ago, with a greater accuracy than satellites can do today with your cell phone? Did you guys know that? So people knew how to do this. And I think it's funny when folks point at the Renaissance and say, well, that's when they learned that the world was round. Well, no, they always knew the world was round.
And we see this simplification. It's unclear amongst scholars. There's constantly argument over whether or not this is a stylization, so it's intentional, or whether this is a issue of lost knowledge. It's simply clumsy because they don't know how to do any better. And Charlemagne gets special treatment because, of course, he's developing the liberal arts and the use of Latin and pushing literacy in his kingdom, an issue that will become important later. Now, I do want to compare this to another equestrian statue that we've seen, the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius. And when we look at the two, obviously the image of Marcus Aurelius is far more realistic, although the size of Marcus to his horse is similar to what we see with Charlemagne to his. It doesn't help our argument, but it does show sort of the high point of Rome versus the high point of the medieval, which is sort of what we're in right now. We're in the Carolingian Renaissance, where we see conscious and deliberate revival of the ancient Roman state and a flourishing of visual arts. This Renaissance is really embodied in this equestrian portrait, this attempt to return to the grandeur of Rome, although this equestrian portrait sits on a desk or a shelf, and Marcus Aurelius was, of course, life-size. But if you leave that completely aside, they're kind of not really the same. I can't even make that argument. But that's the argument that's frequently made, that they're trying to get back to this grandeur of Rome.
I don't know if they are trying to get back to the grandeur of Rome. I think it's just a different level of showing different things that are important. So we're almost done. I wanted you guys to look at this link, and it talks about Carolingian architecture. There's some things that I think are really very specific that I want you to be aware of. If my computer will pull up the imagery. I'm sorry, these things are not showing up really well. One of the things that you will see with the Carolingian architecture is there is some very specific tie-ins to what we saw with the Byzantine architecture, where you have the central dome. Some of the things that are different, though, is that with the Carolingian stuff, let's see if we can find an image of it. You're going to start seeing things like this, exterior flutes with the domes instead of just the prismed octagon. And you're going to see this very interesting triangular shape. This triangular shape is very different from that Roman style roof. Remember, the Roman style roof is 22.5 degrees. This is actually a 60-degree slope. This is an equilateral triangle, and is used in the slope of the roof is used in a lot of Carolingian architecture to remind people about the Trinity. So you have the equilateral triangle and the slope defined by the equilateral triangle to remind people about the Trinity, because Charlemagne is the Holy Roman Emperor. He is the one who's bringing back the glory of Rome under the umbrella of Christianity. And so this talks about some of these things. Another thing that you'll see, let's see if we can find an image of it. I'm sorry, I'm not seeing. Oh, this is a little bit frustrating. I'm sorry, I had something keyed up. One of the things that you'll see in a lot of the buildings that were made under the Carolingians is you've seen pictures like Notre Dame, where you have two towers, one on either side of the entry, and those two towers represent church and state, reminding you that politics and God are of equal importance. And you'll see that a lot. So so it's a revival of Roman architecture like the Byzantines had. You'll see a lot of the times the fluted roof. You'll see the 60-degree slope roof to remind you of the perfect equilateral triangle, which is a symbol of the Trinity and reminder that Christianity is overall. And then you'll see the two pillars, that are the two towers, that remind you of the church and state. And then I want you to look at the book arts, learn about that, see what those guys were doing. And remember that these paintings, you do get a lot of detail and it's really tiny. And that's one of the reasons why so many things are distorted, because the person only has a certain amount of landscape and the artist is not dealing so much with capability or ability as they are different things like the viscosity of the ink that they're using and surface tension. That's kind of limits how big your lines are going to be. Do you guys understand that? It's not because they were stupid, it's because of the tools that they had. So any questions, anything like that, or observations before we tie up for this week? So no, everybody got it? Great. So on this, I want you to go through and look at all those videos. There, I try to pick only ones that are 1 or 2 minutes and see what you can find. I want you to find something that looks like architecture, something that looks like sculpture, and something that looks like the book arts, just to look at it. And then you can pick one thing to do your weekly reflection on. But I want you to be mindful as you are describing and thinking about these things. Be mindful, is the artist doing what they're doing because they're ignorant, or doing what they're doing because of the priorities that they're working with? So something to think about. Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you guys next week and weekend, and have lots of fun trying not to get arrested over the weekend.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend.
You too.
Thank you.
We'll see you.